Right. Hi. Thank you for joining us. The East Baton Rouge Parish Library is proud to bring you this virtual program as part of our 2021 One Book, One Community series, celebrating The Yellow House by Sarah M. Broom. To learn more about this program series, including links to check out the book itself, visit readonebook.org. My name is Jessica. I'm here with the East Baton Rouge Parish Library. And I'm also here with, we're joined by 4 presenters who will be sharing with us just a few ways that Louisiana acknowledges significance of place through historic preservation. They all share a connection. They're all under the Lieutenant Governor's umbrella. So first, I'm going to have everybody introduce themselves. We'll start with Rodneyna Hart.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rodneyna Hart. I'm the Museum Division Director for the Louisiana State Museum System. And I want to talk to you about the significance of place. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen. Is that okay?
We'll have everybody else introduce themselves and then we're
going to do introductions first.
Okay.
Sorry.
No worries.
I guess I'm next. So hi, I'm Emily Ardoin. I'm the National Register Coordinator in the Louisiana Division of Historic Preservation. So I'm going to be talking to y'all about the National Register of Historic Places and how that defines significance.
Hi, I'm Nicole Hobson-Morris. I'm the Executive Director of the Louisiana Division of Historic Preservation, and I'll be talking about changes to our environment, to our built environment.
Hi, I'm Maegan Smith, and I'm the Archaeology Outreach Coordinator here at the Louisiana Division of Archaeology. So I'm going to jump in after Nicole and cover some archaeology and regarding place.
Yeah. Well, thank you. So again, this is tied to The Yellow House by Sarah M. Broom. Places can be meaningful because of the emotions they produce, the experiences that happen while we're there, and the way that they shape our identities. We're going to get started with Rodneyna Hart, and she's going to be able to explain how the State Museum acknowledges place in one very specific way. This is not the only way that it can be done.
Yes. So we started with Sarah M. Broom's beautiful work of art. It's a textured and elegant story of a home, of value that's not determined by its proximity to wealth, but instead its proximity to emotional value, to family, to investment and rich memory. In a similar way, the context that we create our significance within the museum system is not always the most valuable object, but sometimes it's the most culturally significant. So there are lots of wonderful organizations that's mission is aligned with ours. They imbue significance to objects, to structures, to regions, and they're able to discuss this in meaningful ways that elevate the conversation and the standing of these places within our environment. So under DCRT, or the Department of Culture, Recreation, and Tourism, we have significant and specific ways that we design or designate significance to objects. So within the Louisiana State Museum, we are going to talk about what we do specifically. So we're under the Lieutenant Governor, as Jessica said earlier, but with the Department of Culture, Recreation, and Tourism, we're in the Louisiana State Museum System. There are 9 museums, and the downtown Baton Rouge Museum is the Capitol Park Museum. So our mission is for the Office of State Museums is to collect, preserve, and present as an educational resource objects of art, documents, artifacts, and the like that reflect the history, art, and culture of Louisiana for the citizens and visitors to the state of Louisiana. So Capitol Park Museum specifically is a survey of Louisiana. We show lots of amazing sites and we transport people to those sites in one building. And the other location that I'll be focusing on today is the Edie White Historic Site. That location is a historic plantation home, and it's on the bank of Bayou Lafourche. So the themes that I'll be developing today are object as place, place as place, and place. It'll make more sense whenever I explain it. So first, let's start small. So when we're thinking objects representing place, we understand that the power of our material culture is that we can extrapolate from a small object significant, deeper meanings, and it has nothing to do necessarily with the scale. The grandeur of the story of Louisiana at war is specifically told through this one projectile. So in 1815, there was a Battle of New Orleans, and this object was found on the grounds of the Chalmette National Battlefield. It helps us completely understand what happened at that space, the lived experience of those who fought there, the conditions maybe that they could have seen, and also it tells a much grander story than it just being one object. So when we talk about place representing place, Clementine Hunter is one of our foremost, the foremost African-American Louisiana artist. She is known worldwide, and this entire section in North America, in the North Louisiana region of our exhibition really talks about her life and her surroundings. So from starting with Clementine Hunter as the focal point, we can see that we understand her life, her work, her residence, her history, but also the significance of place, and that we reproduced the Africa House in the museum so that we can, in some ways, transport you to Natchitoches, to Africa House. And this frames this entire exhibition. So you walk in, you understand the history, you get a sense of place and scale, you then learn more about the significance of the person through building a place within a place. One of the major barriers for people to take in culture and history is transportation. So if we can get you to the museum, you can experience many things. There are other vignettes like the Acadian Cabin that talks about traditional storytelling, the Festival of Lights, which shows different lights within that Natchitoches tradition, and vignettes that also talk about Louisiana music. There's even a recording studio that you can understand how does that work. So after talking about significance of place in a transported place, we're gonna now talk about place as in where the significance lies. The fact that these historic buildings has been restored, maintained, and brought to a place of significance within the museum system. So this house is the Edie White Historic Site. It was originally created as in a Creole style cottage around 1825. The facade remains the same, more or less, but the interior was remodeled in 1834 into a Greek revival style. So it's much more equilateral, and the first floor was separated into four more or less equal rooms with a grand hallway in the middle. But this object, this home, exists as a snapshot of historical architecture. There are also themes that are developed within the museum itself. Why is Edie White Historic Site a Louisiana State Museum? Well, I hope that we can explain that within the interpretation. It's situated on the bank of Bayou Lafourche, near Thibodaux. In addition to the cottage that we saw in the images before, it's on 6 acres of property, and it has 400-year-old oak trees, rustic kitchens, and a rustic kitchen that was a reproduction, and a visitor center. And then inside the museum itself is interpretation. So the first residents of Bayou Lafourche were Native Americans. Right now, we acknowledge the Chitimacha as the first residents of that land. The Acadians and the Isleños, or the Canary Islanders from Spain, also the French Creole and enslaved Africans and their descendants, they formed a new culture in Bayou Lafourche. So the wealthy American and French Creole planters, they invested in that land. They created sugar plantations. So their visual interpretive knowledge that we now understand is that the enslaved individuals who worked the land and maintained the homes have an acknowledgement within that space. Also, after the Civil War, there was a very rough transition to wage labor. So those individuals, it all culminated in the 1887 Knights of Labor strike, which ended in violence. It's sometimes referred to as the Sugar War or the Thibodaux Massacre. There's also the direct influence of it being a home of some major political players. So Edie White Sr. was the 10th governor of Louisiana. It was also the birthplace of his son, the Chief Supreme Court Justice Edward Douglas White Jr., and his siblings. Edie White is probably best known for being part of the majority ruling of Plessy versus Ferguson, but he also was the 1896 writer of Gun versus United States, which struck down the grandfather clause, which disenfranchised many Black voters in the United States South. So we see that there are many different ways in which this place could be interpreted. We've also recently added furniture that was original to the home or to that time period, so that you can understand that this was a family home. In fact, one of the most significant things is that there's a space in what used to be the kids' room that you can see someone drew a bike into the wood. So this space has a lot of significance, and it's built in different ways. And through our interpretation, we are able to show why this museum is now a part of our museum system. It tells a complete and whole story about life and a snapshot that we wouldn't have if this site were not preserved. It was added to the National Historic Landmark Registry in 1976. That's it. And I know Nicole was going to speak next.
Great, thank you, Rodneyna. Let me share my screen. Okay, are you guys seeing my PowerPoint? Great. And so I'm going to give a quick overview of the Office of Cultural Development. We are also located within the Lieutenant Governor's umbrella. And my slide is not advancing. There we go. The Office of Cultural Development is our lead is Kristen Sanders. She is the Assistant Secretary of the office, and she's also our State Historic Preservation Officer. And then we have a Deputy Assistant Secretary who is Carrie Broussard. And we have five, because we added a chapelaya, but we have four here, shown here, divisions within the Office of Cultural Development. And so today we're going to focus on historic preservation and archaeology. And really our divisions comprise the State Historic Preservation Office. And so we focus on above and below ground resources. So real quick, just sharing that the Division of Historic Preservation encourages the preservation of Louisiana's significant historic sites and buildings through the process of National Register listings, educational opportunities and grants, and tax incentives. And we're really going to focus on the National Register program and also how our communities evolve and change due to various factors. And I'm going to turn it over to Emily, who's our National Register Coordinator, to talk about that program. Thank you.
Okay, can y'all see my screen and hear my voice? Okay. So hello everyone again. I'm going to be talking about the National Register of Historic Places today. If I can get my slide to advance. Okay. So the National Register is a type of designation for historic resources at the federal level. It's administered by the National Park Service, which is a federal agency, and resources are nominated through authorized agencies for states, tribal lands, and federal agencies. So the State Historic Preservation Office that Nicole was talking about is part of that structure. And our division serves as the State Historic Preservation Office for the state of Louisiana. And so any resources that are nominated for the National Register come through our division. You can see here, it's the official list of the nation's historic places worthy of preservation because they illustrate something important about our history. And it was part of a national program to coordinate and support public and private efforts to identify, evaluate, and protect America's historic and archaeological resources. The National Register came out of the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, which was in large part a response to widespread urban renewal after World War II, where older buildings across the country were being replaced with new, more modern buildings. And this was the first national policy governing historic preservation on a nationwide scale. The president at the time, Lyndon B. Johnson, convened a special committee, and they found that the Historic American Buildings Survey, which was a federal program that documented historic buildings beginning in the 1930s, had documented 12,000 buildings by 1965, and half of them, roughly, had been either lost or altered or damaged beyond repair. So at its heart, this really was an effort to encourage preservation of those tangible resources in our built environment, mostly. Even though it's intended to encourage preservation of the tangible resources, the register listing doesn't place any kind of restrictions on private property owners. And it also doesn't guarantee funding or other assistance for maintaining a historic property. I'm not going to read through this whole list. But it can provide opportunities for financial incentives in some cases. And in those cases, the work that's done on a property is subject to regulation. So it's focused on preserving the historic integrity of these resources. It requires federal agencies to consider the impact of their projects on historic resources and projects that are funded or licensed by federal agencies. But it's primarily honorific, and that can encourage preservation in a more informal way as well. Louisiana has more than 1,000 listed resources in the National Register all over the state, and that includes resources like the Vieux Carré, the French Quarter that you see in the top left corner there, which is one listing, but it's a district, so it includes all of those individual components within that building too. So when you're talking about individual buildings or sites, there's quite a few, more than 1,000 that are listed in the state of Louisiana. And those include really widely known resources like the ones that you see here, but it also includes resources that are not as widely known, but that still reflect something important about our history, architecture, or culture. And resources that are listed in the National Register don't have to be nationally significant. It does go beyond the level of personal significance that we're talking about with the book, but it does recognize resources that are significant in some aspect of an individual community's history, or the state, or to the nation as a whole. So here are some types of resources. Buildings are the most common probably, and what you think of really when you think of historic preservation a lot of the time. But also other objects like bridges or dams, sites, designed landscapes, cemeteries, other types of sites. And districts, which are groups of individual resources that are significant together for the same reason. So something like a neighborhood or a campus might be listed as a district. In order for something to be listed in the National Register, it has to, age is usually a requirement. Because this is considered, historic significance, and that does rely on the passage of time and the benefit of historical perspective. But also, in addition to something being old, the register defines significance and integrity, which are both requirements for an object to be recognized. So how do you define significance on this kind of a scale and fit it into a form, a nomination form? The register has defined criteria, and like I mentioned, that can be significant at the local, state, or national level. So something can be considered significant for its association with an event or a pattern of events, a significant people, architecture, design and engineering, or archaeology or information potential, which is something that Maegan will be talking about a little bit more after me. So to define significance for these purposes, historic events, architectural styles, and the resources and properties that illustrate them don't occur in a vacuum. They're part of larger trends or patterns. So this revolves around the idea of contexts. Those are the patterns, themes, or trends in history by which a specific occurrence or a property or a site is understood, and its meaning and ultimately its significance is made clear. So here are just a few examples of resources in Louisiana that are listed in the National Register and why they're significant. So downtown West Monroe is a district. It's listed in the area of commerce. So it is, its significance lies in the fact that it was the main commercial hub of West Monroe during a certain period of time in its history. The David L. and Jeanette Ross May House in Crowley was the home and workplace of two people who were significant in the history of education and also politics and government in Crowley. The Alexandria Post-War Suburbs Historic District is significant as a collection of a certain type of architecture within the history of Alexandria. And then Poverty Point is significant for what it teaches us about our history. The other element
significance is established. The other major requirement
I'm sorry.
register listing is
this was a recorded presentation before, and I thought I had taken all the recordings out, but let me see if I can get that. No narrations, no timings. Okay, let's see if we can get back there. Hearing me twice saying slightly different
Once
things.
significance is established.
Nope. Okay, can everyone still see the slide even though it's not in slideshow mode? Okay, I'm just gonna go that way. Integrity is the other element that's required for National Register eligibility. This is an important element. It's essentially the ability of a resource to convey its significance. And that's what requires the tangible resource to be there. And that significance can be conveyed in many different ways. It's conveyed through its location, especially if it's the location where something significant happened, rather than, say, an example of an architectural style that's not necessarily as tied to where the resource is. It's the setting around the resource, its design, its historic materials. All of those other aspects come together and result in integrity of feeling and association. The resource has to be recognizable to someone who would have experienced that place when at the time that the significant thing was happening. So the most extreme example of that is something. You have something that's
Once significance is established.
Sorry, I thought that one didn't have a recording on it. The most extreme example of that is if the resource just isn't there anymore. It's not physically present. And in cases like that, we look at other ways to recognize significance. Because the register is focused on preserving, the tangible resource. The tangible resource has to be there, and it also has to still, essentially look like it did, not as a reconstruction, but still, still containing its historic materials and being able to tell its story still as the resource itself without the benefit of other, types of interpretation that we might use to explore history in other ways. So sometimes all that you're left with is a site that might have some below ground resources, and Maegan is going to talk to us more about that aspect.
Before Maegan jumps into below ground resources, I'm going to speak really quickly about other changes that we see to our historic environment. So let me share my screen. 1 minute. Let's get into slide mode. Okay. So I found this cartoon and I thought it was quite appropriate. Can you all see? The screen, thanks. And, as Emily talked about the National Register program, one of the things we always get, which is really not true, but folks always believe that once the property is listed individually or part of a district, you cannot touch it. No matter how many times we say that it is honorary and the owner may, make changes to their property at their own free will, unless there is some sort of tax incentive associated with the project, or if there's a Section 106 review, certain programs would require approval or that guidelines are followed. But I just thought this was cute because, they're ready to charge, but we've got to turn back. But really and truly, life brings about change, and we know that our communities change. And I thought that Ms. Broom did a really good job of showing, and sharing the importance of that yellow house to her and her family. And then, you acknowledge the change. It is lost, but there's still so much history associated with that area. And just of course within their hearts, they'll never forget. So as we move on, climate change is one of the biggest factors, issues that we're facing right now with our historic environment, our built environment. And so when we talk about National Register and we look at National Register criteria, we know that many of our historic districts were listed. Can y'all see my cursor? Well, the top left is located in Broadmoor Historic District, the top left house. And that is, an elevated house. It was elevated as such because, historically it was elevated. Okay, now post-Katrina, we're seeing a number of other houses within Broadmoor that need to be elevated, or the homeowners have elected to elevate due to the devastating, effects of Hurricane Katrina. And eventually, we will have to reevaluate our historic communities, because we may see, this change come about. It's definitely going to be an alteration. And some may say it's a negative alteration, some may say it's a necessary alteration. What we've come to understand is that the community is still intact. We have alterations, we have, changes to our resources, but for many homeowners, it is retaining that house that has so much importance to them, while accepting certain changes that are needed, so that perhaps the next storm, they'll be ready, or the devastation, flooding will not be as bad. So one of the communities where we found as really served as a teaching ground for us is the city of Mandeville. Right after Katrina, Mandeville does not have levees. They have no protective levees. And so unlike the city of New Orleans, where we have the Corps to provide protection via the levees, Mandeville does not. And so they really took the brunt. It was really devastating. And over time, they realized that, okay, we need design guidelines, because the National Flood Insurance Protection Program really dictated that their buildings be elevated upwards of 14 feet. And so, of course, that is a significant alteration. If the property was elevated, now you've got what probably amounts to 3 stories now, to more than 2 stories here. And so the houses that are shown before design guidelines, it was a reaction. The city of Mandeville and their floodplain manager looked at how these changes were affecting their built environment, and took the time after to really guide homeowners to ensure that, okay, well, if we realize we have no choice, we have to elevate, let's provide some sort of guidance to allow them to maintain that home, elevate the property as needed, but still also maintain some of that historic element where possible. And so I thought these guidelines were really descriptive, and provided a lot of the property owners with the guidance that they needed. There are no National Register districts in Mandeville, but there are a number of individually listed resources in Mandeville. And one of the things, we look at when we're considering National Register districts is, were changes or were events, certain events, a part of the reason we see certain actions take place. And as we look at how Mandeville is evolving, I think, in time, perhaps usually that 50 year is what we measure. we may be looking at a shorter period. That would all depend, but the catastrophic events of Katrina really set in motion a number of changes that have now shaped the way our historic environments now look. And so with the National Register program, those are the types of things that we, will have to consider perhaps in a shorter period of time. But the city of Mandeville is on the move. They have now elevated 85% of their homes. And, if you want to see a before and after, their city planning office, has some good information to share on that. But I think, just wanting to really briefly talk about how our communities evolve due to various issues or various conditions, right? And after Katrina, there were a number of booklets that we developed, elevating design guidelines for historic buildings in the GO zone to try to guide, because again, we don't want to lose these resources. So instead of losing the buildings, these design guidelines really help to guide our property owners in, once elevated, how does the staircase now, how does that now fall? If it never had railings, because you've now elevated your building, what type of railings would be appropriate? And that's some of the same things you were seeing in the previous slide from the city of Mandeville. The resilient heritage, protecting your historic home. We worked with NCPTT and the National Park Service to provide that booklet, to prepare that booklet. And it also has some information about storm shutters. And so it's so many layers, so many different factors that go into preparing and protecting a historic building and an historic house, because often they may not have had shutters. Well, now we need to introduce certain elements to secure them, right? And then the history of building elevation in New Orleans was prepared by FEMA through a mitigation process, Section 106 mitigation. It is really, it provides a lot of good history and information, and show how, been elevating buildings forever. And so we have that information on our website. And then most recently, guidelines on flood adaptation for rehabbing historic buildings. The National Park Service came out with those guidelines, and it's really informative. They're continuing to work on the guidelines, but that's the latest bit of information that we have to assist property owners in moving forward with elevating their historic resources. And finally, before we move on to Maegan, I want to share that we have our state historic plan, First Jamaica Rouge, and that is a plan that encompasses both the built environment and archaeology. Okay, and that's my contact information. All of the booklets that I mentioned can be found at louisianahp.org. I'm going to turn it on over to Maegan. Thank you. Let's see.
Thanks, Nicole. Everyone can hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm about to share my screen. Okay. Can you see the presentation? Yes. Okay, great. Okay, so as Nicole mentioned earlier, the Louisiana Division of Archaeology, switching yet. There we go. Falls within the Office of Cultural Development. And to go a little bit more in depth, the Division of Archaeology, our mission is to promote Louisiana's cultural history through the protection of archaeological sites and the preservation of material culture. We're also responsible for coordinating and implementing state and federal guidelines for the investigation and preservation of prehistoric and historic sites, both on land and underwater. All right. So what exactly is archaeology? It's pretty closely aligned with anthropology, which is the study of human culture. Archaeology is what connects human culture and history to what our ancestors left behind, or what we call the material culture. And examples of material culture, typically what we find and what we're talking about in archaeology have to do with physical objects that more than likely have been preserved over time, such as bottles. Those are probably things that you've come across in, any kind of backyard dig just randomly. But material culture has a very broad range of a definition. And so what we are about is finding and locating and documenting while we are also preserving. Because one of the things about archaeology is when you're going out and searching and you're digging, you're actually destroying a site while you're doing that. And so what we want throughout the entire process is to document everything so that we have all this information to pass down later. Okay. So material culture, whenever we talk about that, it's referring to physical objects. Artifacts is typically what we call those. You can also find material culture in archives, like in libraries. There's all kinds of different types of resources. Material culture also includes buildings, which is what historic preservation covers. And as we're talking about spaces and place. And it isn't to be confused with non-material culture, which are things that help us to connect these objects with the people and why they were using them. That's probably one of the most important questions that we could ask whenever we are studying these objects and ultimately cultures. Why? Why are people using these objects? What are they using them for, and how to carry on these traditions and beliefs and stories? Well, and language. And in the book, in the Yellow House, this is one of the quotes that kind of popped out to me. It's towards the end of the book, and she's talking about how Carl went into the house after Katrina, and he started collecting things. And that's something that I'm sure everybody can kind of relate to, because when we're talking about material culture, we're talking about the physical objects. They don't necessarily just represent what we do with them, but they also represent who we are and the people that we love, and so many more things to specific individuals. So if you're thinking about it in terms of archaeologists going out and finding objects, we are only really able to understand information about these objects and the culture based off of information we kind of already know. And so one of the questions that comes up is, how much can we know about the significance of these objects if we don't have other information to compare it to, or to put it together with? And so at the Division of Archaeology, not only do we preserve objects, and not only do we kind of oversee archaeology projects throughout the state, but we also document, which I kind of mentioned earlier. And some of those documentation projects that we do include using GIS or software to help map out sites. In particular, this map is showing all the mound sites in Louisiana. Mounds are one of those places. I don't know if you can see my background. I took this on top of Poverty Point in 2012 while I was there. But if you've been to a mound site, you can really recognize how place and space is significant because, I mean, sometimes the locations themselves are so vast and have such a profound significance just by looking at it. However, a lot of that significance also comes from what is within. And so there are many sites that archaeologists haven't actually uncovered or gone into because, as I mentioned before, if you dig into them or dig in any space, you are also going to destroy that site. So some places are left to remain significant because you can tell the significance just from looking at it, or from historical records or cultural stories and background that has to do with its significance. And one of those criteria for Section 106 it's called a traditional cultural property, and we call those TCPs. And I bring that up because it's more so in reference to a significance of place and how that space or, a few structures has meaning to a community, and passing down that cultural heritage and those traditional beliefs to the community that it's, that surrounds it or that uses it. And sometimes those communities are still using it to this day. We do have one in Louisiana, but there's quite a few in the United States, and a lot of them have to do with historical and prehistoric backgrounds and communities. So kind of going back, some of the things that our office covers are mounds, of course, throughout the state. And we also have a couple of pamphlets that we offer so that you can go and take your own driving tour to kind of understand that significance on your own time and to get a feel for what those spaces actually feel like, because there's only so much you can really tell from a photograph. So if you do have some time, I suggest driving out to some of the mound sites if you can, because they're pretty cool. And we also use these little markers that help us to identify locations that you might not be able to see anything. And even if you can see it, just like a mound, as I mentioned before, there's other information that we can represent from documents, from people's history that's been passed down. So we use those a lot, I can tell you that. Some of the other things that we do, we also have teaching materials, because one of the things that I think is really important, at least for me, is making sure that I am learning on my own. And self-taught education is important, because why would we find it significant unless we're interested in it? And so we offer some teaching classroom exhibits, our traveling trunks. Right now we have a COVID option, so we can easily clean it. But normally we have objects that you can handle, and you can really understand what that material culture at least feels like, not just what it means to somebody, but also like the weight of it in your hand, and potentially what that would feel like when using it as our ancestors would have. We also have activity guides for teachers to use and students in the classroom. We're also currently working on an exhibit with the Capitol Park Museum, and that's with Rodneyna, and it's on a shipwreck. It's called the Mardi Gras shipwreck, and that's going to be opening in June 1st, so keep an eye out for that. But along the same lines, we have interactive exhibits on the website. We think that educating the public is really important, and so you can go onto our website and look at how place plays a role in these sites that we're talking about. When we go out and identify archaeological sites, not only does place play a big difference or a big role in how important the site is, but it also is how we identify it by where it's located. So if you think about it, place and has a lot to do with archaeology on various levels and in different ways. And we also have Archaeology Month, which is every October. We also produce a poster, which is all online right now. So we're hoping to get some more public programming coming out of that. But it's usually surrounded by a theme, and a lot of those themes typically have to do with a site, which is in a specific location. And so one of the things I wanted to point out before we kind of wrapped up was there's different ways that you can help us preserve the significance of our culture and our cultural heritage, and how we're going to pass that information down, not only to our descendants, but also so that people can understand, why we use cell phones if there are no electronic documents for us to figure out why that is, or even looking at ways that you could create maps or writing and journaling. That's been some of the hugest helps for, museums and historians and people that are creating exhibits and archaeologists trying to put together the significance of these objects. So collecting oral histories from family members or community members, you can use your local libraries and museums. They usually have a lot of options for you in regards to like your own research and educating, but also things like recording mechanisms so that you can take oral histories of your family or community members, and creating artwork. So hopefully you'll be able to take some of these tools and not just help your community, but also help us in the future, people who are helping to preserve and share this information with other people about what we're doing today or what we did 100 years ago. So I think we have time for some questions. I wanted to just also say thank you to everyone for joining. And I also wanted to mention that all of those options are on the Discover Archaeology website, but at the crt.state.la.us website, you can find us all there.
So does anyone have any questions? I didn't see any questions in the chat. Oh, okay. Bob Kaufman asked, would you like to discuss how place can bind us together, but also divide us? I think that is a really significant question. As far as the State Museum goes, it's interesting that we are able to have Edie White Historic Site as one of our museums. When I first took this job on, I understood that I would now be the division director for a plantation home. And that creates a wealth of complex questions. But I do understand that these are specifically the places where these questions and concerns should be addressed. That we are preserving not just the pleasant histories, but also we're preserving places that remind us who we don't want to be and what we don't want to go back to as a society. It's extremely important that we are preserving and we're understanding the context and the deeper enrichment that we gain from just being a part of this entire society, and that Louisiana is so incredibly rich with history. Our history did not start as a Black person, our history didn't start with slavery. And as a Louisianian, our history didn't start with us becoming part of the Louisiana Purchase. We go much further back and it's much richer. And because we're looking at it from a scientific point of view, but also a human centered often point of view, we understand these richer stories that we can share with our public. Did anyone else want to comment on that question?
From a National Register perspective, that's something that we come across. A National Register nomination becomes a document of historic record. You're talking about demonstrating the significance of a place. You're only required to demonstrate, it's only required to meet one of those criteria, but sometimes there can be layers upon layers of other, aspects of a property's history that in some cases are not addressed, especially in some of the very earliest National Register nominations. As time passes, we're always evolving and gaining a broader and deeper understanding of significance and and what that all means. So that is something that we're looking at focusing on now is in addition to always trying to list new properties and making sure that we're including an honest and complete history of anything that's listed, but also going back and addressing some other aspects of history that might have been not adequately addressed or in some cases not addressed at all in resources that were listed decades and decades ago. Those documents can always be amended, and I think they will continue to be as we continue to evolve our perspectives on what we consider significant, right? Because you could really get into some questions there. Who's to say what is significant? And that's something that is always evolving.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Nicole.
Thanks. Okay. I wanted to touch on, again, the New Orleans area and post-Katrina mitigation, Section 106, disaster recovery. There was so much, personally, so much information gained through that journey, and it's still going on. We've been working with FEMA over these years to try to document before a property has to be demolished or move or, save a resource with the community. But to that gentleman's question, I think about the housing developments in New Orleans and, where the Housing Authority of New Orleans, the housing developments perhaps were constructed, some for African Americans, some for white only. And again, that change, that word, that's a powerful word. And we all have to deal with change. I mean, if we don't change and evolve, we cease to live. But as folks who lived in these housing developments, they may have experienced, quite a different lifestyle. We had, where I learned how the housing developments that were constructed for whites, once that white flight, once they moved out of the urban environment, the African Americans who moved in, it was a whole different ball game. And it was, the way they were treated and different things of that nature. And so while, various individuals can say, oh, I used to live there. Yeah, and have a positive, a positive memory, and it's like, oh yes, that was, sharing all of this and all of that, and then another can come and say, yeah, I used to live there, and it wasn't the best experience for us, but it still comes back to community, and these two individuals, while they share that same the memory of that space, divisions, negative or positive, depending, so it's an interesting, it's a great question. And, really and truly, we really look at how our environment, how we react and respond. And to our environment in different ways. You know, it's a lot there. Not enough time to talk about.
One of the quick things that I wanted to add was thinking about it also in terms of Native Americans and the division of land itself. And so recognizing that when we are talking about place and identifying locations and dividing land, not everyone considers it like that. And not everyone considers it as yours or as mine. And sometimes it is more a communal understanding of this is our place. This is our land that we can all enjoy and share with each other. So that was just a quick thought that I had in regards to the question in particular. Yeah.
Well, thank you all for your insightful comments. You know, this was an amazing experience, and I'm very grateful to be a part of it. You know, I don't get to see you as often as I would like to in our little DCRT family, but we are close and that our missions align so well, and that we really care about what we are doing, about our sense of place, about how it's established, and also that we are improving and strengthening the bond of community through the work that we do. So I want to thank everybody for watching. This will conclude our program for today, and we look forward to seeing you at other library lectures in the future. And we're so happy to the East Baton Rouge Parish Library for hosting us. So we'll see you next time. Bye.
Thank you.